Good morning, my friends. Lama Jigme Gyatso of the Buddha Joy Meditation School. In the last guided meditation video, we explored the second noble truth of causation. And I promise you that in this guided meditation video, we would explore cessation, not from the fundamentalist point of view, but from the liberal point of view. And as such, we look at things as arising and then disappearing, and then manifesting and then disappearing, and then manifesting and then disappearing. So a pleasurable emotion may come and then it'll go, and then it'll come and then it'll go. Once it's here, it's not here forever. Once it goes, it's not gone forever. And the same is true with painful emotions. They come and they go. They come and they go. To quote the late Theravadan teacher, Ajahn Khan, everything arises, everything passes away. So when we look at, when we put this in context, we put this narrow little portion of, when we put this third aspect of the Four Noble Truths in the context of the fourth base of mindfulness, in the context of the entire four bases of mindfulness, that is arguably the essence of Buddha's complete method. For the text, the Maha Satipatthana Sutta, which in English translates as the Greater Discourse upon the Four Bases of Mindfulness, which I call Buddha's Larger Meditation Manual. In the introduction, the author says this is the complete path, which infers we don't need an encyclopedia galactica of ethical and metaphysical advice. All we need is this little, small, albeit ungainly text. And in the context of this text, what we see emphasized is not the choosing and rejections of various intellectual or emotional or physical or circumstantial states. What we see is the acceptance of all states predicated only upon our ability to notice them and to work with them or dance with them or surf with them effectively. The fundamentalists are about the opposite. They're about picking and choosing intellectual states and emotional states and physiological states and circumstantial states. I used to do that. I was displeased with where the journey, I was displeased with the destination it was taking me to. When we look at the history attributed to Gautama, who was given the title Buddha many, many centuries ago, we see that he had the courage to start over again and again and again. As a man very close to 30, he started over from a prince to a homeless contemplative. And then he started over with his first teacher. Then he started over with his second teacher. That's 3-star severs. And then he started over with asceticism. And then he started over again in solitude with the path mindful, the middle path mindful. And what we see in Buddha's history, or at least the biography attributed to Buddha, who may have just been a legend, was the courage to question his actions and his beliefs and his practices. We see a man who valued the effectiveness of what he was doing much more than the time and energy and sacrifice he'd already invested in what he was doing. A man who was pragmatically driven by results by spiritual efficiency. And we see here that that sort of pragmatism can be an excellent antidote to pride and fear and superstition. We are all subject to those impulses. What separates the men from the boys and the women from the girls is not whether those impulses are present, but whether we are slaves to those impulses or not. According to the myth of the Buddha, he led a sheltered existence until one day he came face to face with the abject sufferings of the commoners, the sufferings of birth and illness and old age and death, and that had a sobering effect on him. Before then, he was just, concerned with his trainings as a prince and the goings-on at court. So, in view, from the perspective of the fact that all living beings suffer at birth, they suffer from intermittent illness, they suffer from old age, they suffer at death and at the prospect of death. Not to mention, all living beings suffer from, or at least experience stress from not getting what they want when they want it, not keeping what they'd like for as long as they'd like to, in addition to enduring what they frankly don't like. In view of the universal presence of stress and its causes, pride and comfort and convenience and self-esteem don't really matter much. And so Buddha, or the man who would be Buddha, Gautama, was more committed to the effectiveness of the path than his own pride. To a much lesser degree, I've done my best to, on my journey, always be willing to question my assumptions, my practices, what I was taught, and be willing to be open to a better way. I invite you to do likewise. So let us replace the fundamentalist intention of picking and choosing our circumstances, sensations, emotions, and thoughts. Instead, embrace the liberal path of exercising the courage to flow from one state to another state to another state spontaneously. And for that journey to be marked with mindfulness and insight, also known as simply noticing and processing, also known as noticing and relaxing. So from that perspective, in the last video, we explored, if my memory serves correctly, 60 different contemplations. Help us get used to the fact that we have moments, well, there's interdependence. When something's pleasurable, we're greedy for more pleasure. When something's painful, we hate it and want to push it away. These things are normal. Now we come to the third noble truth, cessation. And it's the opposite side. Sometimes we can be exposed to something that's painful and we don't hate it. Sometimes we're exposed to something that's pleasurable and we're not greedy for it. Because greed comes and goes, and hate comes and goes, just like pleasure comes and goes, and pain comes and goes. Everything arises, everything passes away. Everything arises, everything passes away. And so our goal is not to control the arising and the passing. Our goal is to master the path, noticing, relaxing, and flowing, so that we can be happy and healthy and well-adjusted. For me to be happy and healthy, well-adjusted right now, I better go get my water. I'll be right back. Thank you for your patience. Now that you have received the introduction, let's begin. I'm going to set my timer, which is more of a suggestion than a real control of how the guided meditation goes. Goodness gracious, there we go. Okay. As I've mentioned previously, the greater discourse upon the 4 bases of mindfulness is pretty much like an epic song. It's full of verses and refrains and verses and refrains and verses from refrains. We're going to begin, like we do most guided meditations, with a portion of the refrain that I refer to as the extensive core. This is a very generic practice that works with whatever circumstance or sensation or emotion or thought we're experiencing at the moment. So sit properly, head over shoulders, shoulders over tush, legs folded comfortably. We want to sit as comfortably as we can with the full knowledge that after about 30 minutes, it's going to be uncomfortable. After about 55 minutes, the pins and needles oddly will begin to go away. Don't ask me why. It's merely a consistently observed phenomenon. I like to meditate with a mala. A mala is a Buddhist rosary. If you don't have one, you can order one. Below the video is a button that reads Show More. When you click that, it'll take you to a whole bunch of links. One of them will take you to the supplies page. You can order either a small beaded mala for small fingers or a big beaded mala for big clunky fingers. On that same page, there's all kinds of free downloads you may enjoy, free translations and commentaries to the Tao Te Ching, the Mahasatipatthana Sutta, and Zapatrul Rinpoche's Last Meditation Manual. So, enjoy yourself. Let us begin by either A, if you don't have a mala, touching the tip of your right little finger to your thumb. Otherwise, if you do have a mala, please count it upon your right pinky. Remember, since we're primates, we pull the beads as opposed to pushing the beads. And of course, we push them for each, or one bead for each cycle of breathing. We're going to begin with a rhetorical question. On the in-breath, we're going to ask, what notice? On the out-breath, we're going to intend relaxing. We do this silently. We do this mentally. This is a rhetorical question. There are 2 types of questions, my friends. Hard-ass questions that require an answer, and lazy bastard questions that don't. Welcome, my friends, to the lazy bastard path to enlightenment. So, we're asking our subconscious what it's noticing, circumstantially, physically, emotionally, intellectually. And as long as we ask the question in harmony with the in-breath, as long as we relax in harmony with the out-breath, we will make progress on the path. I guarantee it. So let's dig in. What notice? relaxing. Now we're going to play with a rather simple, visceral approach to interdependence. What's inside? What's outside? The simplest form of practicing insight is relaxing into the present moment. And we're going to do that now. We're going to blend relaxation with interdependence. What's inside? Relaxing. Before we do, let's touch the tip of our left thumb to our left little finger. What's inside? Relaxing. Please count your mala on your left little finger and release the fingers of your right hand. Palms up on your knee. Relaxing what's outside. Now we're not relaxing what's outside because we can't do that. We're just intending to relax our body as best we can on the in-breath. And on the out-breath we're asking, hey, what's outside? So here we go. Relaxing what's outside. Some people might say, dude, why aren't I getting stoned? Why aren't I entering into deep trance? Why aren't I getting a cheap high? Well, there are different schools of meditation, and the school popular amongst the Han people of China, they practice mind blanking. In the meditation common to many Hindus of the Indian subcontinent, they enter different states. Buddhist fundamentalists often chase various contemplative states. They chase bliss, they chase joy, they chase contentment, they chase tranquility, they chase vast openness, vast awareness, non-graspability, and spontaneous awareness. But liberals choose not to chase these states. In the context of Buddha's large meditation manual, we do not chase states. We simply notice what's going on. If we are feeling subtle bliss, we notice that. If we're feeling non-graspability, we notice that. But our journey is not predicated upon nifty, neato metaphysical experiences. It's predicated upon the mastery of noticing and relaxing and flowing, or in other words, mindfulness, insight, and spontaneity. Master those things, and everything else takes care of itself. So I can jibber jabber, and you can laugh at my jokes, or not, and you can still progress along the path. Without your eyes rolling up, your jaw hanging slack, and a string of drool descending from the corner of your mouth. Let's go back to what notice, relaxing. Now you could say, Lama Jigme, I'd rather notice my breath than my circumstances, sensations, emotions, or thoughts, because those little bastards can be uncomfortable. Give me the safety of my breath any day, you may be saying. And my response is, hey, mindfulness ain't for pussies. So put on your big boy shoes and do this deal. Now let's take a visceral approach to impermanence or change. What's coming? What's going? And now let's weave some relaxation into that. What's coming? Relaxing. I'm breathing faster than you because I am talking. The rate of breath is inconsequential. Let's continue. Relaxing. What's going? What's coming? What's going? And then we conclude the extensive core practice of the refrain with this simple exercise. What notice? Relaxing. Please count your mala upon your left ring finger. If you don't have a mala, just touch your left ring finger thusly. And so now we stand on the precipice of 60 exercises exploring the impermanent nature of all that we desire and all that we hate. Permanent nature not only of the objects of our desire and hate, but of our experience of desire and hate itself. And by the cool thing is, by the 60th exercise, you are just so over any resistance to change. You're like, okay, I get it, fine. If Gautama was the author of this, and if the legend of Gautama is true, this boy was raised to be a prince. His education was superior. And when we look at these 60 exercises, we see something very analytical and methodical and pretty darn cool. Pretty darn cool. It would be a mistake to confuse Gautama with Cheech and Chong. Although if he was alive today, I'm pretty sure he would dig Dark Side of the Moon. The first of 10 sets is as follows. We're going to deal with the organs of perception. So we're dealing with a question that is divided in half. The first half on the in-breath, the second half on the out-breath. How could this body be painful and yet hate for it cease? How could this tongue be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this nose be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? When I was in high school, the perfume Lorraine became very popular, and when I first smelled it, I went hog wild over it. However, there were times when I could smell it and I was like, oh, no big deal. So, greed comes, greed goes. Hate comes, hate goes. That is the nature of things. How could ears be pleasurable and yet greed for them cease? How could eyes be pleasurable and yet greed for them cease? How could mind be painful and yet hate for it cease? Well, of course, mind can be pleasurable sometimes and painful at other times, but it's probably the painful aspects of mind that draw so many people to try to escape from it or suppress it, even though we're not going to do that ourselves. How could this mind be painful and yet hate for it cease? And now we come to the second of 10 sets of contemplations. This second set of contemplations is going to deal with the objects of perception. How can phenomena be painful and yet hate for it cease? Please touch the tip of your right ring finger to your thumb. How could sights be pleasurable and yet greed for them cease? How could sound be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? Please count your mala upon your right ring finger. If you have no mala, just touch the tip of your right thumb to your ring finger and give your left fingers a minute off. Give them a break. Let them relax. How could this scent be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease. How could this flavor be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? This reminds me of sex. Well, of course, I'm a tantrika, most things do. But consider this. Remember what life was like at the peak of puberty, where we were in a seemingly perpetual state of tumescence. We wanted sex all the time. We were horrified we would die virgins. Fast forward 10 years, maybe 20 years, and sometimes we were horny, other times we weren't. The sexual desire comes and goes. It's a wonderful illustration of the cyclic nature of phenomena. Let's continue. How could this sensation be painful and yet hate for it cease? And now we come to the third of 10 sets of contemplation. We deal now with consciousness. How could body consciousness be painful and yet greed for it, hate for it cease? How could tongue consciousness be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? For instance, if you're an omnivore and you're eating ice cream, you may get halfway through the ice cream and lose interest in it. Or if you're a vegan and you're having homemade sorbet, maybe with banana and strawberries, one through Cuisinart, you may get halfway through a bowl and go, I'm done. You don't hate it all of a sudden, you just lost your greed for it. That's very common. How could this nose be, let's try this again. How could this nose consciousness be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this ear consciousness be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this eye consciousness be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this mind consciousness be painful and yet hate for it cease? Now return to the fourth of 10 sets of contemplations, and we're going to deal with contact. Now, what does that mean? Well, body contact is when our body comes in contact with that which generates a sensation, like a massaging hand or a pricking needle. Your tongue comes in contact with food when you eat. Your nose comes in contact when you smell a scent. Your ears come in contact when you hear a sound. Your eyes come in contact when you see a sight. Your mind comes into contact when it experiences a phenomena. So let's start with that. How could this mind contact be painful and yet hate for it cease? So I'm pretty much arbitrarily assigning various parts, pleasure and pain, just so that we get a feel of how to apply this for aversion or for avarice, for pulling or for pushing. The mind's not always in pain. The nose isn't always in pleasure. Everything comes and goes. Everything arises. Everything passes away. Let's take a moment to counter mala upon our left middle finger. If you don't have a mala, just use an imaginary one. How could eye contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could ear contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could nose contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could tongue contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could body contact be painful and yet hate for it cease? And now we come to the fifth of 10 sets of contemplations. And this is just subtly different than the previous one. How could the feeling of body contact be painful and yet hate for it cease? Please touch the tip of your right middle finger to your thumb. How could the feeling of tongue contact be pleasurable and yet hate for it cease? How could the feeling of nose contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? Please count your mala on your right middle finger. How could the feeling of your contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could the feeling of eye contact be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could the feeling of mind contact be painful and yet hate for it cease? We've made it halfway through, kids. Well done. So we're going to take a break and go back to the refrain. We're going to do the concise core variation B. What notice? Relaxing. And we're noticing this is free skate. We notice whatever you notice, whether it's circumstantial or physical or emotional or intellectual. What to notice? Relaxing. How could this not be independent? How could this not be permanent? How could this not be grasped? Remember, these are rhetorical questions. It is not our job to answer them. In fact, our journey on the path is actually improved by not trying to answer them, just by asking them and relaxing. What notice? Relaxing. Now let us turn our attention to the sixth of the 10 sets of contemplations. We're going to deal with perception. How could phenomena perception be painful and yet hate for it cease? How could sight perception be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sound perception be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could scent perception be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could flavor perception be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sensation, perception be painful and yet hate for it cease? Now we come to the 7th of 10 sets of contemplations. We deal now with volition, which is a synonym for intention or will. How could sensation, volition be painful and yet hate for it cease? How could flavor, volition be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could scent, volition be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? Please count your mala upon your right index finger. If you don't have a mala, please use an imaginary one. How could sound, volition be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sight, volition be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could phenomena, volition be pleasurable? Let's try this again. How could phenomena, volition be painful and yet hate for it cease? And now we come to the 8th of 10 sets of contemplations. We'll return our attention to either craving or aversion. How could this phenomena, aversion, be painful and yet hate for it cease? Please touch the tip of your left index finger to its thumb. How could this sight craving be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this sound craving be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? And by the way, let's count our mala upon our left index finger right now. How could this scent craving be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this flavor craving be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could this sensation of aversion be painful and yet hate for it cease? And now we come to the 9th of 10 sets of contemplations. And the 9th set deals largely with thought. How could this sensation, thought, be painful, yet hate for it cease? How could this sent thought be pleasurable, yet greed for it cease? Earlier in the guided meditation, I explained that many fundamentalists of many spiritual traditions try to select their circumstantial, physical, emotional, intellectual experience, which is probably why the late Trungpa Rinpoche penned the text Cutting Through Spiritual Materialism. Because whether we use corporeal means to realize our selection or non-corporeal means, it's still materialistic, as opposed to being yielding and flowing like the Tao. Let's continue. How could scent thought, oopsie, let's try this again. Yes, how could flavor thought be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sound thought be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sight thought be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could phenomena thought be painful and yet hate for it cease? And now we come to the 10th of 10 sets of contemplations dealing with distraction. Fundamentalists typically are into concentration, which tends to be very, very, very rigid, and like a pane glass window can shatter. They tend to view distractions as the enemy. However, liberals dispense with concentration and instead play with mindfulness. We're mindful of whatever thought or sensation or emotion or circumstance is cartwheeling across the stage of our awareness, in the theater of our mind. And so it's much more resilient, kind of like a Nerf ball. If you can get hit in the crotch, I recommend that it be by a Nerf ball and not by a football. How could this phenomenon of distraction be painful and yet hate for it cease? Please count your mala with your right ring finger. How could this sight distraction? How could sight distraction be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sound distraction be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could scent distraction be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could flavor distraction be pleasurable and yet greed for it cease? How could sensation distraction be painful and yet hate for it cease? That completes the 60 contemplations. Let's return to the portion of the refrain that I call the core. Let's perform concise variation C. What notice? Relaxing. How could this not be my identity? What notice? Relaxing. Please count your mala with your left index finger. How could this not be my possession? What notice? Relaxing. Let's conclude with a bit of the old karuna, compassion practice. Imagine you're standing on a huge area rug. It's shaped like a giant bullseye or archery target. In the center red disc, it's approximately 1 or 2 meters, is yourself. And the innermost white ring surrounding the red dot are your neighbors, family, friends, associates. On the second ring, the red ring, we see all earthlings, whether they walk or crawl or swim or fly. And on the white outermost ring, we see all beings from all worlds. And so although our goal is universal compassion, we start with self-compassion and we baby step it out. We use our natural momentum to feed the next step. So we're not actually doing magic right now. We're just exercising our compassionate volition, our will, our intention. Soothe my fatigue, relaxing. Soothe neighbor's fatigue, relaxing. Soothe earthling's fatigue, relaxing. Soothe each being's fatigue, relaxing. And we conclude with what notice? Relaxing. And that, my friends, is that. I have close to 21-hour-long guided meditations on my YouTube channel. If you're just starting out, work with one every morning and one every evening. And within a month or two, you won't, just like a kid outgrowing training wheels, you won't need them anymore. And that's the goal. To be able to get more and more comfortable at productive, authentic mindfulness meditation so that we can build our mastery of noticing, relaxing, and flowing. The Wednesday series of weekly meditation classes begins the 4th of May. For those in the Southern California area, they'll be held in Burbank. For those who live elsewhere, you can participate over a live webinar simulcast. To register, use that button I told you about before that reads Show More. Give that a click and find the appropriate link. People often ask me, how much do I charge? It's by donation. Some give 0. Some give as much as they would to attend a yoga class. Some spend as much as they would during a night on the town. The choice is yours. I leave it to you. The only thing I insist upon is that you arrive to class at least 5 minutes early, that you treat your classmates with respect and consideration, and that you do your homework every morning and every evening. Now, at first, that'll be a challenge. It will inspire many questions. So jot those questions down and either bring them to class for the next week or submit them in great detail in the comment area below, and I'll do my best to answer them via video. May you and yours be healthy and happy. Bye-bye now.